Several Storm Shadow cruise missiles recently supplied to Ukraine by Great Britain have been shot down by Russian air defenses over the past 24 hours. That according to the Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense. The ministry spokesperson, Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov, announced during a briefing Tuesday that, quote, 7 Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles, 3 HARM anti-radar missiles, and 7 HIMARS multiple rocket launcher shells were intercepted. According to Konashenkov, 22 Ukrainian drones were also destroyed, this over the newly incorporated territories of Russia, the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. He also said that a Russian overnight missile barrage on Ukrainian military formations, hardware, and depots of ammo and equipment provided by the West had, quote, achieved its goal. All intended targets were hit, closed quote. Among those targets, he said, was a U.S.-supplied Patriot missile system, which was destroyed in the capital, Kiev, by a Kinzhal hypersonic missile. Russia had announced the downing of its first Storm Shadow missile on Monday. Meanwhile, Kiev continued to promise a mighty spring offensive even as the final month of the season approaches. In one interview Monday, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he believes Ukraine will deoccupy Crimea and that the Russians will flee the peninsula. He also said that Russia's President Vladimir Putin and the occupation authorities of Crimea have brainwashed people, promising billions of dollars of investment in the peninsula. Well, for more on that, we're going to speak with attorney and activist Dan Kovalik, who just returned this past weekend from a trip to Crimea, and ask him what he saw on the ground there. Well, welcome back, Dan. Quite an adventure you were on. It's always an adventure to go that far away, and I've been to Russia myself a few times. Never been to Crimea, for example, and that is the hot spot on the planet these days. Why don't you tell us some of the things you've seen and participated in while you were there? And welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's just a beautiful place. You have to go there now via ground transport, either drive there or train because the airspace is closed because of the war. So Rick Sterling, my friend, and I went by train 27 hours from Moscow to Crimea. That in itself is an adventure and interesting. Crimea is a beautiful place. You know, it's a peninsula in the Black Sea. When there wasn't a war going on, you could, take a ship to Turkey, for example. It's just an idyllic place, really. And, I think the truth is, despite claims by Zelensky in the last day or so that Russia has ruined the place, in fact, Russia's done a lot to help Crimea since the Crimeans voted in 2014 to rejoin Russia. First and foremost, Russia has brought water back to Crimea. Ukraine, in a fit of rage, built a dam to cut off water from that went to Crimea. And near the beginning of the special operations, Russia bombed that dam and released the water back into Crimea. So this big reservoir they have there's been refilled.
Right.
People have water again. The other thing Ukraine did was to cut off electricity from Crimea. And for 8 months, people didn't have electricity. Unless you had a generator, people were in pretty dire straits for those 8 months. Again, Russia's helped re-electrify Crimea. They've done a lot in terms of, renovating parks and public spaces. It's a beautiful place now, and very tranquil. People are out and about during the day, during the night. People seem happy. And by the way, before the special military operations began in February of 2022, mainstream sources in the U.S. said just that. They people went there and said, people are very happy there. Polls show
even the polling, right? Like Rasmussen and another one over here did polling over there. In other words, Western legitimate polls. It was like 90% or 85% of the people would still want to be part of Russia.
Exactly. And, even they say, oh, but what about the Tatars, who certainly have been, seen their share of repression over the years. Once Crimea rejoined Russia, again, the Russian government did a lot to try to win them over. They're building a giant mosque for them in Crimea, which I saw, a beautiful mosque. The government actually rehabilitated the Tatars from the claims that they were collaborators during World War II. They gave out compensation to the Tatars. So, people are pretty happy there. I would want to live there. I mean, it's an incredible place. So
seaside resort, who wouldn't?
yeah, and it's fairly affordable. By the way, interestingly, I witnessed this myself. A lot of people still live in this Soviet housing that they got under the Soviet Union for free, and it's still free. I mean, that is, if they got it for free back then, they still own it. And I, had lunch at someone's Khrushchev era Soviet housing project, and the apartments they're small and modest but nice, and people redecorated them and did what they wanted with them, and again, it's an amazing place to be.
Free is a nice rent.
Yeah, not bad if you can get it.
So
sure.
The things you were talking about when Kiev shut off the water, shut off the electricity, you're talking really beginning in the period almost within a month and a half after the coup, because these were reprisals for the referendum that I think took place in Crimea, like within a month or a month and a half of the coup.
Yeah, so I think the coup was in February of 2014, and they had the referendum
March, right?
In March.
Yeah.
And I talked to people involved in the referendum. Again, this was provoked. The referendum was provoked by the government in Ukraine after the coup. I mean, the first thing that government did was outlaw the Russian language. Almost everyone in Crimea speaks Russian on a daily basis, even if they're Ukrainian or Tatar. It is the language of Crimea.
Yeah.
The culture is Russian. We have to remember, Crimea was part of Russia beginning in 1783 under Catherine the Great. Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine in 1954, but it didn't really mean much because, Ukraine and Crimea were still part of the Soviet Union. So people, it's kind of as we say in the legal business, kind of a peppercorn.
Right.
One thing I learned, Don, and I didn't know this, I went to Crimea. This is very significant. In January of 1991, so the year that the Soviet Union ends up collapsing, although it was really a coup that overthrew it. But in January of 1991, Crimea held a referendum to become an autonomous republic, and they overwhelmingly voted to become an autonomous republic. What does this mean? When the Soviet Union then ends up collapsing at the end of 1991, Crimea should have been treated as its own country. It should have been its own republic, because that's what they voted to do. That is to say, Ukraine really never had a proper claim on it to begin with.
That's right.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and certainly not after the referendum of 2014, which by all accounts was free and fair, and people overwhelmingly voted to join Russia. And again, because of Ukraine's heavy-handed tactics towards its Russian-speaking people.
I remember the days of the Vietnam War, as heavy-handed as they were, as the U.S. was against Vietnam at that time, with carpet bombing and burning villages full of people and all of that. There was at least some homage paid to the concept of trying to win their hearts and minds. And looking at an electoral map from the 2010 presidential election, the last one, that was before the coup, the last free and fair election in Ukraine by international standards, according to international observers, that whole part of the country was heavily in favor of the President Yanukovych and their votes were concentrated in particularly the Party of Regions, which was the party that elected him, but that had a big chunk of representation in the Rada. They were in essence, after the coup, which took place in the other half of the country, negated as in terms of having a political voice at all. In order to do these other things, we're going to take your culture out of the basket of cultures that make up our national life, and we're going to start bombing the hell out of you because you're acting like you don't want to play with us on our terms.
Well, no, absolutely. It began, well, I mean, it really, let's say, accelerated the Ukrainization of Ukraine. That is to say, the goal of making Ukraine a monocultural, monolingual country when it was never that.
Right.
Right. And by the way, let's also remind ourselves that Zelensky himself was elected overwhelmingly on a peace platform. His whole platform was that he was going to make peace with Russia.
Right. And also
that would also mean making peace with his own Russian-speaking people, right?
Yeah,
and he himself betrayed that. Yeah.
That's his language too, by the way.
Right.
He's a Russian speaker.
That's right. He did not know Ukrainian when he was elected. He's learned Ukrainian and apparently speaks it with a Russian accent. You know, these Russian-speaking people in the Donbass, in Crimea, you know, they've been treated as second-class citizens. And so is Ukraine surprised that they don't want any part of them anymore? I mean, and again, when Crimea votes to join Russia, Ukraine just cuts off water and electricity. Do they think those people will ever want to go back? Of course, they never will.
Yep. All right, Dan, thanks a lot. Anything else you saw that you think we should know about?
Well, let me just say one last thing about generally in Russia. I happened to be there for the May 9th celebration, celebration of Victory Day over the Nazis. And it was so exciting to see people, come out in huge numbers to celebrate this. And by the way, it was very interesting. And I was told this was the first year that this happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was ubiquitous.
Really?
Throughout Russia. Everywhere.
Wow.
And people driving their cars with big red flags on it and red flags draped throughout the cities. And, people are starting to, openly show their pride in their Soviet history. And I thought that was great.
That's very interesting. More on that next time. And I want to see some more pictures and some video when you have a chance to process all of it.
Absolutely, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.